offering a big thank you to the Winfield Library. They've hosted a number of these presentations in support of the Centennial and as part of their overall educational program. And I think that's an outstanding resource for everyone. So with that tip of the hat, I'd like to start off on the program. I was giving some thought as to what I would call the program. And that's when I kind of came to the idea of when a pebble starts an avalanche. Kind of as an evocative title, it kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of motion and cause and effect. And the overall purpose of the presentation is to explore the history and the value of the Illinois Prairie Path. And as Don mentioned, I'm the president of the Illinois Prairie Path Not-for-Profit Corporation. I've been on their board of directors for 20 years, and I've been their president, which is a huge honor, for the last, since 2013. So a little while. Okay. For those of you who may not be as familiar as you might like with the Illinois Prairie Path, I thought the best way to start is with a map that shows the Prairie Path in general. The Prairie Path itself is a Y on its side. And if you look at this map, you can see in the heavy red line, a line that goes from east to west starting in Wheaton and then goes off to Maywood. That's the Illinois Prairie Path main stem. And then the next piece I'll point out to you is the portion of the path that starts in Wheaton and then goes off to the northwest up to the Elgin, which is cleverly called the Elgin branch. Starting in Wheaton, going to the southwest is the Aurora branch, going, interestingly enough, to Aurora. There are also two other smaller spurs. One starts in Winfield, goes through West Chicago, and then goes to Geneva, called the Geneva Spur. And the other starts on the Aurora branch and then heads off to Batavia, called the Batavia Spur. So you probably notice we like nice, obvious names that don't take a whole lot of thought, and they typically involve destinations. Now, if you look in the upper right part of the screen, you can see the Illinois Prairie Path logo. When you look at that logo, you can see the big oval, and then you can see the 3 railroad spikes. That'll be important later, but notice the shape of the spikes. It's a Y, and if you kind of think of that and turn it 90 degrees, you can see it's the same general shape of the Prairie Path, which looks like a Y on its side. The Illinois Prairie Path itself is about 62 miles. It goes from Cook County through DuPage County and then over into Kane County. It was the first major path system that was done in this area, and it is a rails to trails conversion. So one of the questions I get is, why is it called the Illinois Prairie Path, and where did the Illinois Prairie Path come from? Well, as I mentioned just a moment ago, it is a rails to trails conversion, and that is where an old rail line, which has been decommissioned, is then repurposed as, in this case, a path system. And the origin of all of this was the Chicago Aurora and Elgin electric rail line. And that was in business for about 50 years. It started, of course, in the city of Chicago, and then it served the areas off to the west, ending in the Aurora and Elgin area. And it was a pretty major transportation hub. You can see some pictures of one of the old stations in Wayne and one of the electric cars that was used for the transportation system. Well, one of the major changes to the transportation system in the United States was the construction of the interstate highways. President Eisenhower was a big proponent of building the throughways, expressways, the 2-lane, 4-lane, and more advanced type of highway systems. That was when we really had a huge explosions in the automobile. And that's what killed the Chicago Aurora and Elgin Railroad branch. Back in the day when most of the roads were dirt roads, gravel roads, or cars weren't very common, this was the place, this was the means to get from point A to point B. When the interstates and the highway systems were constructed and more people had automobiles, this system fell into disuse. In the early 1950s, they wanted to file for bankruptcy, but the communities wouldn't let them. And finally, what happened is in 1959, everyone got on the electric rail line. They went downtown Chicago, they finished up their day, and they came back, and the whole system had shut down. And what had happened is that the company running the electric rail line had been filing, and they finally got approval to basically go bankrupt. and stop service. So people were stranded in downtown Chicago, kind of a shock. And so then the rail line went into receivership, and it was dissolved. So they stripped out everything of value, sold the cars, ripped out the rails, ripped out pretty much anything that had any conceivable value, including some of the old steel bridges that were in places, sold it all for scrap. And by 1961, the whole thing was formally abandoned, and it reverted to its previous owners. In most cases, that reverted to DuPage County and in our area, in some areas to municipalities, but the entire area was gone. So this is where the Pebble that starts the Avalanche comes in. The eminent naturalist and biologist May Watts was way ahead of her time. She was a scientist back when women simply weren't scientists. She worked at Morton Arboretum, and she was a botanist and had a number of rather significant attributes to her. And one of those was she was a teacher. She had a huge following of people who eagerly listened to what she had to say, which was that the people need to have a connection with their natural environment. She had any number of small booklets on how to identify native trees, how to identify prairie plants, and that was all part of her passion. Well, she, like everyone else, noted that the electric rail line went out of business. And back in September 3rd, 1963, she wrote a letter to the editor of the Chicago Tribune, which was the Pebble that started the Avalanche. And I'll just go ahead and read this. "We are human beings. We're able to walk upright on 2 feet. We need a footpath. Right now, there is a chance for Chicago and its suburbs to have a footpath, a long one. The right-of-way of the Aurora Electric Road lies waiting. If we have the courage and foresight, such as made possible the Long Trail in Vermont and the Appalachian Trail from Maine to Georgia and the network of footpaths in Britain, then we can create a strip of the strip, a proud resource." Now, what Ms. Watts probably didn't realize is that she had a larger following, and that her vision to turn what was probably going to be carved up into parking lots and random gravel storage areas would then proceed with the help of countless volunteers into something that now is part of our urban infrastructure. But what happened is it wasn't easy. The other parts of the communities, DuPage County or other entities, they had plans for this now vacated land. Like, for instance, the city of Wheaton was adamantly opposed at back in the day to the wild and crazy idea of a path system in the area. There were people who testified that said the path was going to have criminal elements from Chicago that was going to be invading the good communities of DuPage County. And of course, they wanted to do something more practical with the land, like make parking lots. Well, what happened was even more astonishing, is that May Watts and all of her dedicated volunteers were able to make a really good case to DuPage County, and they got a long-term lease on the former right-of-way for the electric rail line in the late 1960s. And the promise was that then this group of volunteers would actually build a path. And ladies and gentlemen, that's exactly what you did. If you look on the left side of the picture, you can see in just a very short period of time, the path became a dumping ground. It was a mess. A lot of the area had been completely torn up as part of the demolition. And so the first task was to do a massive cleanup, haul away the junk cars, the washing machines, and then literally through the blood, sweat, and tears of all of these dedicated volunteers who were inspired by the vision of May Watts, that wanted to have a footpath that they had within their grasp. If they had the courage and foresight, they went and got it done. If you can look in the upper right corner, you can see a dump truck putting down one of the first parts of the Prairie Path, which is limestone screenings over the old coarse aggregate from the rail line. That was donated by local contractors. So all these volunteers and May Watts basically rattled the cage of other entities who donated materials in addition to their labor to get it done. If you look in the lower right side, you can see what looks like a pretty precarious bridge. Well, remember when the folks who were decommissioning and when the electric rail line was in bankruptcy, they ripped out everything of value, including those old steel bridges. Well, what does that mean? Well, over the wetlands, over the rivers, or the obstacles, those bridges were gone. And so that was almost an insurmountable obstacle. So what did these volunteers do? They got telephone poles, they got random bits of wood, and they constructed bridges that probably violate every single OSHA regulation that you can probably think of, but they were dedicated, and their general attitude back then is, we're going to ask for forgiveness and not permission. Now, those bridges, sometimes they were burned down by vandals, sometimes they were washed away in floods, but what they did is they were able to provide the trail connectivity at the time until a more permanent solution was identified. But this just goes to show the huge amount of work and the vision, the passion that these volunteers who actually built the Prairie Path following the vision of May Watts did. And all of us should have a huge debt of gratitude to these individuals who got the job done. And one of the historic projects along the Prairie Path is Volunteer Bridge, which is in Volunteer Park in Wheaton. Almost all of the steel bridges were ripped out when the electric line was abandoned, except for one large steel bridge that goes over the Union Pacific rail line in Wheaton. Now, the northern part of that bridge, which you can see in the upper right, you can see there are some steel, concrete abutments. Well, that part of the bridge is over the municipal roads, where those bridges were torn out for scrap. So you had a bridge that literally went to nowhere. And if you looked at the edge of the bridge and looked down, you'd see like a 12 or 15-foot drop. So these volunteers then basically rolled up their sleeves. They contacted a professor at a local community college who was teaching steelworking. He and his students then actually built a prefab pedestrian bridge. And you can see in the lower part of the screen, this is the bridge where a crane is dropping it into place. And that was then secured to those old concrete abutments. In the top center, you can see, well, they had this old remnants of the bigger steel bridge. Well, they had to put on decking. So these folks were basically out there securing the new decking. And remember, May Watts was a naturalist, and she not only wanted to trail, but she also felt passionately about the natural environment. So on the bottom, you can see where they're basically burning the area and they're installing a prairie or rehabilitating the prairie. Again, that was one of the visions for May Watts, not just to have a trail, but to have a trail and a connection to the natural environment. So this particular project, the Volunteer Bridge in Volunteer Park, was ended up being one of the signature projects, a huge accomplishment for a group of ragtag volunteers. The total project cost, as I recall, was something in the order of $50,000. The cost for the engineering, if it was done by a proper engineering firm back in the early 80s, would be like $500,000. So you can kind of get an idea of the scrappy can-do spirit that these volunteers did. Another more recent project that's a bit more modest is, many of you may have noticed if you've traveled the Prairie Path, there are mile markers. Folks who do jogging or competitive events, they like these mile markers. It lets you know where you are in the path. Like if you look over on the left, you can see mile 2 on the main stem. Well, the mile markers that we'd put in about 30 years ago, they were looking pretty rough. The plastic had yellowed, in many cases it cracked and falling apart and faded. So one of our board of directors works for a sign company, and he actually designed and put together some new aluminum mile marker signs. So our job was to basically have a little bit of fun and install some signs. This kind of goes to the type of service that our group likes to do because of our dedication to the path. Now, there is a Winfield connection between the Illinois Prairie Path, Not-for-Profit Corporation, and our local community. So many of you may know that the Village of Winfield is doing a Riverwalk Park. Well, that started off as another ground-up citizen idea that then was picked up by the local politicians. The idea was to move the proposed regional trail from the west side to the east side and through Winfield's town center, and then eventually use the low areas and the floodplain that can't be used for anything else and make it a park. And that was considered another wild and crazy idea that only the most harebrained person in the world would consider could happen. But that was exactly the type of project that the Illinois Prairie Path likes to advocate for. So our group then supported working with the Forest Preserve, supported working with the county, and in collaboration with the Village of Winfield, got the formal location for the trail moved from the west side to the east side of the river, so it could go through our town center. Then we also knew that this volunteer group needed a little bit of seed money. So we worked up a way of generating $10,000 to generate some of the first monies that were donated to get the project off the ground. And what was even better is that Central DuPage Hospital at the time was generously matching donations dollar for dollar, so it ended up being $20,000. So then we also had another little small project on the Illinois Prairie Path Elgin branch. We donated a water fountain on the southeast corner of County Farm and Geneva Roads. That just goes to the idea of service to the community to make the path and the path use a little bit nicer. And by the way, this particular trail was actually opened in 2019. So again, it went from a wild and crazy idea that a lot of the naysayers said it couldn't be done. We found partners, got the trail built, and now it's one of the prettiest and nicest part of the trails and it hooks up to the Geneva spur of the Illinois Prairie Path. And you can see an image of the proposed Riverwalk Park. The phase 1 of the Riverwalk Park had its grand opening about 2 weeks ago. And phase 2 is going to be about $1 million, and that's going to be constructed by Northwestern Medicine as part of their overall development project. So, and the trail itself was about $3 million. So let's just say it went from a wild and crazy idea to completion. And isn't that exciting? So we'll talk a little bit about the Illinois Prairie Path Not-for-Profit Corporation. Our mission is to preserve, enhance, and advocate on behalf of the Illinois Prairie Path for current and future generations. Now, what do we do? So what we do is we advocate. So we find partners. We look for other entities like municipalities, the Forest Preserve, DuPage County, citizens group, other folks who want to find ways of expanding and enhancing the path. We also find partners to get projects done. You can see in the middle where that was one of the grand openings for the Geneva Spur, where the Illinois Prairie Path partnered with, say, DuPage County and municipalities to actually build this long extra spur that came off of the Elgin branch of the Illinois Prairie Path. We also do improvements. You can see one of our longtime Prairie Path Board of Directors members, Paul Mooring. Paul and his wife, Jean, were members of the Illinois Prairie Path for 60 years. And there's Paul, well in his early 90s. And what we're doing there is we're rehabilitating a bench that had fallen into disrepair. And so that's something. We also do portalets, we do screenings, and we also manage about 12 prairie and prairie remnants that we manage and enhance and protect in case they're damaged. So one of the other projects we like doing is collaborating with one of our major partners, which is DuPage County. Well, back in 2013, we let the county know that they were a little bit behind because every 10 years or so, they like to do a trail survey. And the purpose of the trail survey is to see, well, how much is the path actually being used? Where is it being used? What can we tell about the path and the path usage? The idea being, if you need at least the basic data to better understand and manage your urban infrastructure, which in this case is a trail. So our group then paid for half of the trail survey. Now, in the past, what a trail survey was someone would be at a specific point and you'd have a little clicker, and when you saw a bicyclist going north on the Elgin branch, you clicked it once, you saw a second one, you clicked it twice. Well, in this case, we had manual, we also had automated, so we were able to use a little better tools. But then we also took it a step further, where we basically interviewed people. And we asked questions like, where do you live? If they were comfortable telling us, how much do you make? What do you spend money on? What do you think is important with the path? And this helped us get a much better idea of the trail and trail usage. Now, it should be a surprise to absolutely no one that year over year, the trail usage goes up and up and up. And so that's important information to have. Now, in the Winfield area, we had a node over in Wheaton. And if you look over in the lower right side by the yellow area, you can see like 193,000. Well, what does that mean? That's the average usage amortized over the year. And so the area in and around Winfield and Wheaton is one of the most heavily used parts of the path. And I think those of you who have been in this area over and also even going over to Villa Park, it is very intensely used. And what that means is that the Prairie Path and the path systems around it, they're part of everybody's life. And that's something it's gone from, again, that wild and crazy idea where the city of Wheaton didn't want it to something where now it's what people name their subdivisions after it. They say the Illinois Prairie Path cycles. And in other words, it's part of something that people have in this now, after all these years, they've grown up with it. So young people, they just assume it's there and they can't imagine their life without it. So one of the more innovative things this trail survey did is it provided us with that extra data, not just how many people are using the path in certain areas, but what do people value? What do they want? So what we found as one of the major findings of this report is what we call the triple bottom line. And the first piece of that is health. And this perhaps should be pretty easy because people would report that one of the main things they like to do was get on the path for some jogging or to be on their bicycle. And that provides some low intensity athletic activity. That gets you off the couch. It gives you an excuse to pull that Twinkie out of your mouth and get out and basically get some exercise. And it's easy to get to. It's something that is approachable. It's safe. And because it's that formal rail line where it's nice in most cases segregated from say traffic or intersections, at least to some extent, it is something people feel comfortable using. The other part is just getting out and about provides stress relief. And I think that's all very important for us to realize, especially considering recent circumstances. And you can see at the bottom that the health benefit of trails, it helps reduce adult health risks. According to the Center of Disease Control and Prevention, recommends 150 minutes of moderate physical activity per week. And that's what the Illinois Prairie Path does. It gives people an opportunity, and it's up to you to use it. The second part of the triple bottom line is the environment. I mean, I think one of the first things I noticed when I first moved to Winfield back in 1996, I moved here because I liked going out and riding on trails. And I lived at the time in, over in the northern part of Chicago, over in say the Evanston area. And if I wanted to do anything on my bike, I had to basically throw my bike in my trunk, or I had to be on these really busy roads. And a colleague lived in Winfield and introduced me to the area, and I was just flummoxed because the area, because of all the forest preserves, because of all the trails, it reminded me where I grew up in Iowa. And one of the first remembrances I have, one of the first times I used the path, I was going north on the Elgin branch, and I literally stopped and got off my bike. And I looked north and I saw that the trees on either side of the path were going up and then arching together and meeting in the middle. And it struck me like a Gothic arch in a church. And it was kind of like a religious experience. It just basically let me pretend, even though I'm in a metropolitan area of DuPage County, which is almost 1 million people, I could pretend because I'm on a trail in the middle of this big, huge wooded area in the forest preserve, that I can pretend that I'm not in a metro area. And that basically then, because of all these really rich array of natural resources we have, not just forest preserve, but also parks and various preserves, that just gives us an opportunity for enjoyment of nature. And because of the nature of the Prairie Path, it's a non-motorized transportation, meaning there are bikes there, and there's some electric bikes, which don't really count. But a lot of people who are jogging, and if you go up toward Wayne, there are people who are equestrians who then use it for horses. And then, of course, other opportunities that lets folks who, for instance, like to do bird watching. And it's kind of a neat area where you basically can go and have easy access to, say, a Lincoln Marsh, and you can see what's going on there if you happen to be a bird watcher. And so having a connection to the natural environment, it increases our appreciation and strengthens our interest in environmental stewardship. And lastly, this is one of the more surprising results of the study, and that's path systems improve the economy. And this is, again, not necessarily very intuitive, but what we found is people want to be by the Prairie Path because it's a part of our urban infrastructure that people really value. So it increases home values. Businesses want to be by it, especially like, for instance, bike shops. I basically clipped the image of Prairie Path Cycles, which is a bike shop here in Winfield. Hopefully they'll forgive me for giving them a free promo. And then what we also found is that people who use the Prairie Path tend to be in an upper income bracket. And those folks typically have a bit more discretionary money, and they spend it on things related to trails, like for instance, a new bike, new running shoes, or whatever, or they just want to, say, take the path and then go out to have a destination lunch when they get to, say, Wheaton or Winfield or something like that. And so what they found is that it becomes something of an economic driver. And the reason why this one is so important is because when you're trying to convince a local or a county politician to allocate scarce resources, And if you can tell them that this will improve your community economically, not just because it's the good thing to do or because you get to have enjoyment of nature, but it actually improves the economic vitality and it draws folks to your community that will be a long-term benefit, that is something that can be a selling point because it's a competitive environment out there. Municipalities and townships and other entities, they've got limited resources and you got to make your best case. So when you're able to show that there's a economic value, this then through advocacy can give you a better chance of allowing those scarce resources to reasonably be put toward trails and trail systems for the benefit of everyone. So what's the future of the Illinois Prairie Path? Well, as I've demonstrated, the Illinois Prairie Path is the backbone of the trail system in our part of DuPage, Cook, and Kane counties. Now that trail network from just being the Prairie Path has since expanded significantly. For instance, you may mention, I mentioned the trail system that's going through Winfield. That's the West Branch DuPage River Regional Trail System that goes along the West Branch DuPage River. That's north-south, and it connects to the Prairie Path. Another trail system that's being built is the East Branch DuPage River Regional Trail, which is also north-south. That also connects to the Prairie Path. So what you're seeing is that as these trail systems become more and more lodged in people's consciousness, as they see the value, as people want to have this as an amenity that improves their lives, you're seeing a gradual and thoughtful expansion of the trail network. The trail network then makes it easier for people to get from where they are to where they want to go. And a second piece of the trail network is something called bikeways. And that's where local streets, typically neighborhood streets, are identified for as a means to get literally from where you are, from your doorstep, to the trail system, which then let you go to, say, get an ice cream cone in downtown Winfield, if that's what you want to do. And so we're also then always collaborating with the county and other entities to improve signage, to improve safety, improve line of sight, and it's like, for instance, doing bicycle patrols on the Prairie Path. Like, for instance, a number of years ago, we bought the DuPage County Sheriff a number of bike kits, so for their officers that do patrols on the Prairie Path. So the whole idea is that we want to constantly have thoughtful improvement, both of the network and also of and improve the existing network, the existing Prairie Path itself. The whole idea is to make connections to get you from where you are to where you want to go. Now, what can you do? Well, one thing you can do, and this is going to be a shameless promo, by the way, you can join the Illinois Prairie Path Not-for-Profit Corporation. So you can be part of our ongoing mission to advocate and enhance the Prairie Path. Like one example of a project we're working on right now is we are donating $50,000 to the city of Wheaton to build a new trailhead on the Prairie Path, on the Aurora branch, right by their city hall. And that is again, one of those collaborative missions where we put up resources and we're able to get that done. That's the sort of thing that we do. You can advocate for the Prairie Path, and you can do that by telling your local town and county councils and your friends and family what you want and that you support the path and the trail network. And then lastly, and most obviously, you can use the trail, which then allows you to support your triple bottom line of health, the environment, and your own personal economy. Now, the last thing I'd like to share with you today is a discussion. I mean, the last year and a half has been really tough on people. Some people have suffered from economic dislocation. Some people have been unable to get out and about as they might like to. And so one thing we noticed when we were tracking the Prairie Path is that the Prairie Path usage really spiked after a lot of the shutdowns in early part of last year happened because of COVID. And so we did a very informal and completely unscientific poll on social media and folks who chose to offer some thoughts. And so I'd like to share with you a couple of messages that were shared with us that basically tells all of us what the Prairie Path meant to people when people were really in a tough spot. And so we've been riding our bikes down the Prairie Path almost every day. We ride to Wheaton to go to 302 and get ice cream, or we ride to Villa Park to get Wellmore ice cream. Another thoughtful commentator said, I would love to chat about this. We recently relocated here from California, sight unseen, and the Prairie Path has been a blessing to us at this time. Another person said, my teens started biking to neighboring towns and now bike up to 20 miles a day. Love it. We also had someone comment, I have run on the Prairie Path almost every day during the pandemic. A couple of weeks ago, I did my own half marathon from Glen Ellen to Elmhurst. Grateful that for the 7-Eleven that was open for a quick bottle of body armor on the way back. So I'd like to thank all of you for joining me today, and I certainly hope that I've given you a little bit of information about the Prairie Path and its history, a little bit about what our not-for-profit does, and so you can get a little bit of a flavor for the triple bottom line, and so you can understand how a Pebble started an avalanche. And the main takeaway is that volunteers make a difference and that your advocacy makes a difference. I'd like to encourage all of you to not be shy. Reach out and do what you can. And if nothing else, just use the Prairie Path. So thank you.